NFL Week 1 does not matter, and that's what we're going to discuss on today's RotoViz Overtime. We are going to work through some of our thoughts on, I guess, reacting to training camp news, to some of the reports, beat reports, what are just opinions, what are factual, and some information like that. Because looking at drafting your roster now, what I'm seeing, Shawn, anyway, that I mentioned before the show is years ago, we obviously were dealing with reports, what was happening at these camps and what information, but there wasn't as much of a coverage, I guess, on the NFL. And we've seen that grow exponentially. We've seen that with all content, and then you factor in social media. At the moment, if a player has a slight limp, or if they have, drop a catch, or things like these happen, quarterback maybe doesn't, have a perfect pass in one of the training sessions, all of a sudden the sky is falling. But on the opposite side, there is also the reports that are kind of showing us that a player may be, the best of his career. He may be stepping forward. It could just be one catch, but this guy can never drop a pass again. He's all set for the Hall of Fame. So there is that balance in between as to what is actually happening. And that is what we're going to work through on today's episode. So as we get ready to kick off this edition of RotoViz OT, how are you settling in? You have been still pushing out that one article per day over the last week or so. And I have to highly recommend checking out a lot of the pieces that Shawn is putting out, as I always do, but some fantastic stuff in the most recent editions that I just think is, not even for the players that are mentioned, but more so working through player evaluation, prospect evaluation, just to, open your mind to all the different scenarios that go into Shawn discussing and targeting these players. So great stuff up on the site. But Shawn, as we get ready for this one, how are you doing as we kick off this week?
Good, right? I mean, you're always fired up about your players who are rising, and you're always thinking to yourself, when the guys get a little bit of negative buzz, well, that's just going to open up a little better price. So someone who was previously trendy, you're going to get a window now to make some of those draft picks before they catch fire again. Colm, this is something that you and I have talked about for years, and yet it's even more important now. And I kind of, suggested maybe we should wait on this show until we were a little bit closer to the season, and then we kind of talk through it. And it seems like it's relevant now, right? People are drafting, obviously, a lot of best ball teams. You and I are in the midst of a really fun dynasty startup draft, the RV Triflex format over at the FFPC. Colm, I think when I was looking at it yesterday, we were in the middle of round 7, and there had been 28 trades. So if you want to get involved in something with that many trades, then look for the next OT listener league, maybe next season, what have you. But those FFPC leagues have a ton of trades. You're going to get engaged owners. Perfect place for you to go over there. And then we have redraft starting. And so, Colm, I'm going to have my articles discussing the best way to beat your home league. Those will be out sometime soon. You and I will be doing a main event draft, possibly a couple of those. We were lucky enough to finish. Was it the very last spot that paid out last year in the race, or was it like in the last 5? We did place.
It was the last few. It definitely was. Shawn, I had forgotten about that last couple of, dollars getting squeezed into the account. I just remember that we were like in the top 15 for a period of, it might only have been hours, but yeah, we were quite hyped at one point.
So we're
going back for it this year.
Did well, but I mean, there's no better time in fantasy than when you're drafting best ball, dynasty, and redraft all at the same time. And we've got to make some tricky decisions, both relatively early and then as we're trying to fill out those last 4, 5, 6 spots on the roster. And so we wanted to work through this idea that the early season results are just part of the picture. And so it's not exactly that week 1 doesn't matter, because there are some big advantages to drafting the best players, the best values, the hottest guys, getting off to a fast start, building that lead in your best ball league. You can't do a ton about it. The team is going to be there or it's not, but you want to see those numbers really start to roll. And then on your redraft team, you're looking at building a team that not only starts fast, but has the right types of pieces so that you can buttress it with free agent selection. So how do you do some of those types of things? Within all of that, we also want to be aware of the fact that being too focused on training camp reports on August 5th or early in August, being too focused on not making mistakes is going to limit your upside. Titles and championships and millions of dollars are won across weeks 15, 16, and 17, not in week 1.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the part of it is that risk profile, and particularly when you're drafting rookies or younger players, or maybe even players who have yet to hit maybe the greatness that Shawn we have hoped that they would since they came into the NFL. In those situations, there may be times, even like we look back to last year, where some of the players do take a little bit of time to come along. One of the players we talked a lot about last year was, say, Rashee Rice. Came along slowly in that Chiefs system, as wide receivers tend to do with Andy Reid. But then we get him, after that bye, continue to break out. And this also more so than for like best ball rosters, because you can't do much about those once you have them drafted. If you're in redraft leagues, if you're in a main event, for example, you have waiver wires. These are situations where if it's week 1 and that doesn't happen, you don't want to be cutting those players. But it's the same at this particular point when you're drafting players and the news comes out. One of the things that me and Shawn had talked about, sometimes on air, a lot of the times off air, was like the news coming out on Javonte Williams and Sean Payton. And then a report came out, this feels like it was like 4 months ago, but it might have been last week, Shawn. And that was that, that he was fighting for a roster spot basically with Samaje Perine. And like the situation is like, I think it might have been even Ben Gretz that had the tweet to say like, yeah, they're both fighting for a roster spot, but like it's Perine who's fighting for the roster spot, not Javonte. But then we get to like the information over the last couple of days, and he's now rising up in ADP and rising up draft boards because of that news. Similarly with like, and you have to adjust to this news, but like Justin Fields at the moment is a player who's moving up draft boards because Russell Wilson has missed a couple of practices. But when we were talking about drafting him, late in drafts, Shawn, 2 or 3 months ago, people were like wondering what we were wasting draft picks on. So I think there's a lot of that. Like it's a case that we can't sit here now and be like, oh yeah, we were right, because the season will tell you what was right and what was wrong. But there's also to adjust to the player evaluation part of it, but also to the news and not to overreact. And with social media and with the information that comes out now, we do have, I guess what would come across as maybe a report, and we were like starved of information there for a while. And one piece of information comes out and it gets circulated by aggregate accounts, and maybe it's not even the original quote, and then it kind of grows its own wings, and within 24 hours that news cycle has changed onto something else. But when that gets out into the ether, people will either react or overreact to it. I think it's important to kind of try and keep a balance of what your belief in that player or that team is, and then adjust it accordingly to that, not to just jump straight to that one particular report at that one particular moment of the day. But that also then, Shawn, factors into the week 1 element of it, because the reason I say that week 1 doesn't matter, and that you made the point that it in fact does matter, because if you have players scoring 30 fantasy points in week 1, they are going to go into your lineup. They're not going to sit on the bench. But the reason that it doesn't matter is at the moment with drafts, and you mentioned the safety and the risk. With the safety is to say, this player in week 1 has this role. He's going to get this amount of rush attempts. He's going to get this, the safe play of and it's kind of the floor play, because quite often then you see that get overtaken throughout the season. And that's very similar now, where you'll see reports, particularly of rookies, where maybe they're not running with the ones, or maybe they have a drop, or maybe, for example, Xavier Worthy gets knocked over at the line of scrimmage and people are saying like he can't play in the NFL. These things get blown out of proportion. And the reality is that sometimes it's going to take a couple of weeks into the season for those particular players to find their feet and to start to move on. And I guess the perceived volume or value of a player heading into week 1 is what maybe now in the next 4 weeks will start to drive players' draft preferences. And my opinion is that we shouldn't be like changing our draft preferences from 6 weeks ago to now. Not that we shouldn't change the players or the ranks or where we're taking them at ADP. We shouldn't just be like, I was comfortable drafting that player 4 weeks ago, but now look, I can actually see week 1 and it's right there. And I don't want to take those risks anymore because that player is not number one on the depth chart where I thought he may be. The reality is that these things take longer to process. And I've kind of rambled on a bit about it, Shawn, but I'll let you come in there. We probably bounce to another part of the topic then, but it's kind of reacting to that news. Like, for example, Jonathon Brooks coming off his injury, we kind of always thought that he would either be brought along slowly or his, injury may mean that he won't be 100% week one. But then the report comes out that he's, likely to be not fully factored in until after week 4. Not much has actually changed in what we knew other than the coaches said that. We kind of thought that would probably be the case anyway. But now there's obviously a lot of panic for, let's say, Jonathon Brooks drafters, but the play is necessarily the same as what we thought a week ago.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that as we work through it, though, one of the things that can give you an advantage is to try and consider the nuance in all of the individual situations and perhaps not apply the rules of thumb
to all the situations.
Yeah. or that aggressively, right? So one of the things with Jonathon Brooks is like, yeah, this information, this knowledge was more or less already factored in. And yet a small portion of it, we're always thinking in terms of scenarios and how you would create exposure to the best scenario at the least possible price. And so if you lose the scenario where he's ready early and he doesn't have to miss time, it may be a case where that was unlikely, maybe extremely unlikely. But if that gets eliminated completely, then you've lost something that was unlikely yet still very meaningful. And to lose that does matter, right? So I think the way that you described it was very important. It's important to remember that it's basically a play for the second half of the season, and it's a play for the fantasy playoffs, and it still should be very good for those things, and now maybe better, right? So you just wait a few days, you get the new price, and now you actually start adding to your portfolio. But at the original prices, one of the possibilities is just that he can play from the beginning and say, and as soon as we lose that for good, then it does matter.
That's interesting to talk about as well, because there will be situations now where it's like, you have a certain amount of that player across your drafts. If you're doing best ball drafts, or if you're just doing, a redraft or dynasty, you're going to have a certain percentage of that anyway. But now that you can get it cheaper, that doesn't necessarily mean that you have, paid more, so you can't pay now. There's that balance as well. Obviously, you have to take in the news of like, well, does it mean that then he gets in at week 4 and he struggles through week 10 and you don't really get anything for 10 weeks? So you have to factor all that in. But I do think that there's always that balance too at this point. And the perception of week 1 obviously factors in with the player moving either up or down in terms of, let's say, the depth chart. But what you do with the price, if you've got him at a lower price, should you, like, people may withdraw from buying him at the higher price. But in the opposite, I think people might just be like, well, that was a bad report, I'm completely out on him. And one of the ones I do think of, when I look back, Shawn, was, the year that we had the run, and he actually retired last week. I meant to bring it up in last week's podcast, was Rashad Penny. And that season we drafted a lot of Rashad Penny when he was with the Seahawks, and he had a pretty terrible preseason. He had a pretty terrible start to the season. But then, like, when he got on the field in the later season, he won people lots and lots of money, including ourselves. But there is always those things of like, the season changes in mysterious ways as it progresses, and you can't always be sure as to when players get opportunities and then what they do with those opportunities. So I guess, that's a tale of, most of the time when you get camp reports like that, that player will amount to absolutely nothing, but it's not always that case as well.
Right. And so you note a very important, because the leverage was so high, situation where it was actually wonderful to have had him in best ball, because new information couldn't get you so off of someone that they were off of the teams, right? A best ball roster prevents you from cutting it, which happened in virtually all of the main event teams. That's a type of scenario that isn't going to happen very often. And yet it illustrates some of the things that we're talking about. You have a run similar to that with Jerick McKinnon, where he's absolutely useless and then has a massive fantasy playoff portion. The situation with Brooks is a little bit different in that, you again are looking for all the possible ways that could play out. We don't want to continue to draft someone who just simply doesn't have the upside or doesn't have the overall scoring to match the price. The other thing that we want to do is we want to be nuanced in how we're looking at the rest of the team. And so, Colm, you and I just selected Bryce Young in the RotoViz Overtime Dynasty Startup Draft. We were in a little bit of, an odd, uncomfortable area of the draft where the next values were veterans who didn't fit our roster. And you look at the next couple of QBs who were drafted, both of them by the same team, Kirk Cousins and Deshaun Watson. Those are interesting picks because, you would guess that those guys score more points than Bryce Young this season. And yet Young has that range of outcomes, and he has more possible ways to win and build value for the long term. And if you're right, you win a lot more than you win by being right on Kirk Cousins or Deshaun Watson. Now, I say that if you end up being really right on Watson, and it's not even so much a case of drafting for that outcome, but obviously Watson is young enough that if he did manage to rehabilitate his career, he would be a fantastic pick at the prices he's currently going at. But the reason I bring up Bryce Young is that we were uncomfortable with that pick because he has not lit up Carolina Panthers camp. He's been okay. And as bad as he was last year, okay is progress. And yet when you get a new coach, when you add all of these weapons around him, you would love for him to be just generating raves, right? So if we're thinking through the Panthers' overall context, maybe the ceiling is a little bit lower than it might have been a week and a half ago. The other element there, and part of this is because they don't have Jonathon Brooks as a point of comparison right now. But Chuba has supposedly looked very good, and Miles Sanders with that contract is evidently fighting tooth and nail to keep a role for himself and to keep his career going. Sometimes you can lose track of the fact that a third stringer has even more at stake than some of these guys at the top. All of those things are additional small pieces, not meaningful pieces, but small pieces that cut against the Jonathon Brooks breakout star thesis. And so if we get those tiny little pieces in concert with news that he's going to be out for a while, then it makes sense to move him down. The question is, do you move him down and then make the selections, or do you move them down and say that they're off your board? That is the choice that you have to kind of work through. Colm, another very provocative and controversial one goes back to your Green Bay Packers. Mm-hmm. One of the big talking points right now is that it looks like Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson will be the starting wide receivers for as much as that actually means something. So then we have this question of what does that mean within the context of where these guys are already being priced? Because if Jayden Reed was the breakout star of this team a year ago, where he had more ground to make up, and now he's in his second season, and we already know what he can do. We already know that he's the most dynamic of these players. And he is already priced as though the other wide receivers are a problem. Because that's the thing that we have to look at, right? We have an issue here where, maybe he's going to be more in 3. But Colm, am I incorrect in saying that the snap counts were 19, 19, 16? Are
21, 21, 19, 16. But that's still pretty close.
Colm, last year, Romeo Doubs crushed the rest of the Green Bay Packers receivers in route percentage and total routes. Part of that is Christian Watson not being healthy. Now, the counter argument to some of the things that I've said is that Watson could stay healthy, and that would potentially make a difference because we know that he is also, or separate from the dynamism that Jayden Reed brings, Christian Watson is one of the best athletes in the entire NFL. His weighted targets per route have been off the charts for a couple of seasons. He has worked on all of these hamstring issues. But we're looking at guys like Dontayvion Wicks and Jayden Reed. It's interesting here because the route advantage for Doubs last year was dramatic, right? He ran 204 more routes than Wicks. In terms of yards after the catch, he finished 80 yards behind. Mm-hmm. In terms of yards after contact, he got blown away by Reed and Wicks. Now, that's not
and just this isn't like a shot at either Doubs or the player I'm going to mention, but like if you think of Doubs, it's much more of the Mike Williams style of player. And Mike Williams does some stuff after the catch at times, but the majority of his career it has been, he catches it at that point, and that's where the play ends. There are players who can, win catches at the point of contact. And I think what'll turn out to be true with this offense is Doubs is more in there for the structure of the offense, for that skill set rather than taking away from a Reed. Like I don't think you can play Reed in the same role as you play Doubs. And I think the offense for the Packers requires a Romeo Doubs style player who can kind of win at the point of contact rather than just players that are consistently running, motions across the line of scrimmage. So what I'm trying to say is Doubs will serve a role in this offense, but I think the offense will, in terms of the dynamism and what happens, will be between Watson and Reed. And then, we mentioned the snaps a moment ago. The snaps, the concern or the talk coming out of them has been Wicks, who was, well behind the other three. But I think as well, he came on later last season, as did Bo Melton. And I think it's going to be a case that the other three are the clear options, and then they are kind of the players that will get roles if there's injuries or players are banged up. Will probably be the way it plays out, as much as I like Wicks.
And so we have so many things that we have to work through because a lot of the discussion doesn't really consider that the price more or less already reflects what happened at this scrimmage.
Yeah.
Christian Watson is already expensive. When you think through the different prices, and there's been so much rhetoric this offseason about Jayden Reed being a problem because he was too expensive for what his role is, as opposed to being too undervalued for the upside and what he provides. And I think it's easy to miss out on what the floor actually is for a player like Jayden Reed because of the offense, because of his dynamism. You look at some of the guys being drafted around him. My contention would be that the risk there is extremely minimal, whereas the upside is significant. And that's the part that's being missed in this discussion.
And the other part that will happen with this discussion is, I mentioned Doubs being kind of a player. He'll probably be out there in the majority of snaps. He'll probably also lead the team potentially in routes. But I think in terms of the efficiency and how they're used, Reed is going to be the most efficient of all these wide receivers. I think Watson will have those big plays as well. But I think, when Reed's out there, he's going to get the targets on those snaps. I'm not overly concerned about, reports from one thing like this. And when it gets into preseason, one of the things that we've seen from some of the teams over the last couple of weeks, Shawn, as well as over the last, I guess, week, is some players are not out there with the first team, for example, on all the practice reps because, they know the offense and they're, giving the reps to people who they're trying to see what they have. So there's also that balance. But I do think that this is probably reflective more so of what the team is looking to do here with how this is broken out.
Yeah, so it is valuable information, right? Because Wicks has been the one for me that is tricky. And he's a player.
But again, he's going in a range where you're past that wide receiver cliff. And I think he's priced very fairly for somebody who has a lot of upside. Like if anything happens in any of those three guys in front of him, he becomes an immediate startable player for fantasy and redraft.
Right. But I think that we still do have to consider that could end up being a wasted selection. And it's one of the reasons why it is after the window. I had basically no exposure to him. Jordan Love has obviously talked him up. I did a deep dive on him, or a deeper look for one of the recent articles talking about players who could rescue you if you fall off the cliff. And one of the things that I think is important to understand there is he's a better college player than people realize, and probably should have gone earlier in drafts. We talked a little bit about some of the yards after the catch, yards after contact. Again, just to reiterate where these players were last season. Dontayvion Wicks, 11 evaded tackles. Jayden Reed, 8. Romeo Doubs and Christian Watson combined for 2. And
I'm guessing, Shawn, there's a chance that both of them may have been Doubs.
They both each get 1 broken tackle. It's funny because both Reed and Wicks have 6 forced missed tackles. Neither Doubs nor Watson is credited for the entire season at making a defender miss. Now, that doesn't mean that that's going to carry over completely into the new year. We already discussed how Watson is a freak athlete, and I think it's easy to underrate Doubs. I mean, Doubs is a guy who came out like in his first preseason game and immediately drew 9 targets. So if he was a mild disappointment as a second-year player, but remains the clear starter in a dynamic offense, there's nothing to say that you can't emerge in year 3. I think the biggest takeaway for me is not so much that you want to drop Reed and drop Wicks, but that you can continue to create some exposure to Watson and Doubs. And Colm, you and I did that, right? We had a pick at the 801. It was over what you might say is sort of the dynasty version of that wide receiver cliff. We'd had names like a Keon Coleman, who has a ton of upside, but is risky. We had veterans like Mike Evans and Cooper Kupp, Devontae Adams all go. Those players could be 2024 trump cards, but are more difficult in terms of seeing how they can add multiple years to your roster. And certainly there's a problem in terms of how their trade value will work. I mean, one of the things that we get into in these drafts is that, yes, they're still being drafted in an area that reflects some trade value, but when you're the person who drafts them, you're already into a very limited group of people within your league willing to have those guys or pay for those guys. And so if you do need to move off of them, then it's a very specific other type of manager who might be willing to interact with you on that. And then they know that you're very limited in terms of who you can move them to. And so you're probably going to have to sell low, even if both managers agree that this guy actually helps the team that's acquiring that player. With those guys gone, and with the way that Watson has addressed some of the issues, the role that he has in the offense, at 801, I mean, he felt like a very good pick for us. Now, because he's not my favorite Packer play for the 2024 season, you know, emotionally, it's not your favorite dynasty pick, but I think that's how you're looking to use this information, as opposed to saying that we have to have a sea change in terms of the way that we're viewing the Green Bay Packers after a scrimmage.
Yeah, no, I would agree with all of that. The other part, Shawn, I guess, just as we'll probably close this out, on my rant on the week one conversation and reacting to stuff on social media and so on. But like, we do have players also getting hurt, so not just a case that player is already hurt from last season at college and is going to miss time, but Puka Nacua has a knee injury, which is described as week to week. And I seen some people on social media discussing, how long before Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua swap ADPs and things like, again, the information that we knew is still the same, and there's no expectation that he would miss the start of the season. There's things like Garrett Wilson and Aaron Rodgers potentially not completing 100% of all targets, causing some concerns there in New York. But I do think that we are so starved for this news, and it's so easy for people to get that information out from a training camp and make it readily available, and then for it to take off and catch like wildfire. We're seeing that with a lot of the younger wide receivers, even, for example, up in Denver. With the Denver stuff, I'm always skeptical of, Shawn. I'm always taking it with a pinch of salt. But you get those quotes that come out as well about players doing such this year. There's, we like Geno Smith, Shawn. There's, the talk of him intending to run more this season. Again,
coming out during the time period where he is mildly injured.
Yeah, so it's balancing it out. So, that'll balance out, Shawn. We don't have to worry about Geno Smith's price changing. It'll just, both of those will equal itself out. But it is kind of getting those balances across and how to react to some of that news. Some of it, obviously, you do have to take more serious. But, Shawn, as we get ready to close out, any final thoughts on kind of our discussion here? My thing would always be like to kind of just try not to jump too much one way or the other. I can remember, Shawn, 5-6 years ago, there'll be times where a report would come out that a player I've drafted a lot of has a mild injury, and it could have ruined my day. But at this point, it's a lot more zen. It's we move on to the next thing. You build that callous, I guess, to it. But I just do know that the way that we share information, and Shawn's fortunate enough. I don't know how he's getting all the information, whether it's on Google Trends or how Shaw's getting the data, but he's not scrolling social media like the rest of us and getting pulled into those wormholes. So what's the advice, Shawn, over the next? I guess now we're pretty much 4 to 5 weeks away from kickoff. So how can people make those correct decisions?
The important thing is to continue to balance what you know about the player's background with the new information you're getting. And if a player has a weak profile and they go through, a couple days of getting, what's still basically puff piece-ish types of enthusiasm, you can move them in your rankings or on your board. You can understand where they're going to and still feel comfortable that now the price has gotten to the point where your risk of being wrong on that player has diminished as the price changes. And so you don't have to chase that price, right? You don't have to go ahead then and make a pick of a guy you didn't originally like and now make it more expensively just because there's been some positive news.
And even if it's somebody, I guess, that you do like, so the Justin Fields example, Shawn, we like Justin Fields late and, those BBM drafts and so on. But, if he starts to creep up into and it's easy for somebody to go from the 18th to the 13th, when you get those hype pieces, there's a point as well where don't just draft them because you had them at a point, always, I guess the thing is adjust your board to the market and don't continue to chase those prices if you have him valued 6 weeks ago as a player who could go in the 14th round and then he's up in the 12th, keep to your process that way as well.
Right. And I think that, you have kind of alluded to the Denver Broncos passing attack. And, what I would say there is that when you have a mid-round rookie receiver, you have to understand what the expectations would be for that. Now, our preference would be to hear that Troy Franklin is lighting up camp every day, right? So it's not something where you're ignoring the information or saying, oh, it's no big deal. I don't even care. I wouldn't rather him be easily their best receiver, because you would.
You would.
Right? I mean, obviously you would. But if he becomes less expensive and you're looking at him and his overall profile in relation to the other sort of three guys that they're trotting out there, and it's still better. I mean, you started out with this premise of week one doesn't matter. And one of the things that we talk a lot about with zero running back drafting for the last decade is don't evaluate the quality of your draft based on how your contingency-based plays scored in week one. You knew, based on how you structured your draft, that these guys were going to require certain triggers or catalysts, whether that's an injury, which you're hoping is not going to be the case, or simply having more time to develop and show what you are, more time to make that ground up on the starter. And you think about how the first month of the season, so many of those things happen. Well, I mean, we're still a month removed even from the start. And so players who are in position to be working through camp and to try and make up those gaps, you want to be realistic about how quickly they can make those gaps up, what the expectations should be. And so you need to have a variety of different types of calibrations that work. You need to understand what the player's profile was. You need to understand what realistic expectations are. You need to understand kind of what he's doing. And then you need to have a bit of a sense of how those three things interact to create different types of likely progressions over the next month and then over the first week of the season. And as long as those scenarios are reflected in a price that is giving you upside from what you're paying and makes sense within the context of your overall team build, then you're still okay to make those picks. That's the part I think that is fun. That's the part that allows you to take all of this news and feel like you can really take advantage of it, as opposed to be anxious about all of the information that's coming out every day.
Yeah, definitely. And I do think that if you can pick times of the day to, once a day, maybe check in, going for a deep dive on all the news rather than, getting 15 updates about the same player within an hour, that can really rack up that anxious feeling. But I think that was a fun kind of process to go through, something that I had just thought might fit in. If I'm seeing it as on a large scale on social media, maybe our listeners are feeling in a similar vein. So good topic to go through. I think we hit on some interesting parts, but stay patient and stay calm would be my advice. But that is going to do it for this edition. As I mentioned, Shawn has a lot of great content up on RotoViz. One of them in particular that I would highly recommend checking out. He mentioned the Jordan Love one, looking at the quarterbacks. Look at that one, obviously, but the JSN conversation is very in-depth, but fantastic to go and check it out. If you want to sign up over at RotoViz, you can sign up using the code RVRadio2024 at checkout. Shawn, I believe the extra discount as well on top of that runs through the start of week one. Is that correct?
It's going to run through at least a little bit more time. I don't want to make any promises. Definitely everybody get in there, get your subscriptions today. This August time period is when RotoViz is such a big weapon for you.
That was a perfect way to really plug it, Shawn. It could run out at any time. Make sure you take advantage. So get that extra discount plus the RV Radio 2024 discount of 10% over at rotoviz.com. Get yourself signed up for a 1-year pass. Get access to all of the content and tools through the NFL season. That's going to do it for this edition. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out his work, as I mentioned, up on rotoviz.com. And until next time, have a good one.